Hello, hello, hello. Today we get to find out the answers to the reading that was posted earlier this week. And I'm so excited because this is our first time going through the reading of the ACT together. So we've been spending a few weeks in our trainings on Fridays going through English. With Miss Tori, you've been going through some math and just recently science. And today we are switching our training up a little bit, and it's the first time going through the reading. So let's go through a little bit of step back a little bit to go back to what are the sections of the test, and then where reading falls in, and then a little bit about the reading test itself. So the overall structure of the test is that we have four main sections. There is an essay that is optional that does not impact your score at all. So the four sections that we'll be focusing on through our training usually will be the English, which comes first in the test. There are 45 minutes for that 75 question portion of the ACT. This tests your knowledge on grammar, the putting things in context, understanding the flow, and organizational skills of grammar and its grammar and the sections that would come under that. Then comes the math. There's 60 questions in 60 minutes, and this section is the longest area of the test. So after both the English and the math, then we take a little bit of a break on test day, and we have about a short break to stretch, get a snack, drink a little bit of water maybe, and then we come right back into the reading, which is the third section of the test. This section is a lot shorter. It's 35 minutes. But 40 questions. And then we have the science, which is our fourth section. It also has 40 questions with 35 minutes to complete that section as well. So one of the things that makes the reading section sometimes students' least favorite or possibly their hardest subject is the timing of these passages. So I want to talk a little bit about that just briefly. So as I mentioned, there's 35 minutes with 40 questions. So we're going to be reading a passage and answering 10 questions in each of those passages. There's 4 total. The dividing equally over across the passages of the four that are there would give us about 8 minutes and 40 seconds. So about 8.5 minutes you want to plan. If you're going to read each with giving you enough time to give you equal time for each passage. And to be honest, the majority of students simply don't have the time to do that. So we want to make sure that we have the strategies to make sure that you're getting the max answers correct that we possibly can, because that's the name of the ACT game. It's getting how many questions we can get correct. So we want to be able to do that in a most efficient way. So the reading section has 4 passages, and they always come in the same order. Those passages would be literary narrative, which would be your passage 1. Passage 2 is always going to be your social science topic. And then we have the topic of humanities, and lastly, natural science, which would be the 4th. Now, in the mix of those 4 topics that I just stated, we have one random floating passage that we call the passage A, passage B, or paired passage. That could be in passage 1. It could be passage 4. In this particular test that I've posted, it is coming in on passage 2. So with paired passage, what we have is that we have 2 passages, and then the questions are going to be comparing and contrasting and getting our knowledge out from those comprehension facts and details that we've been able to pull out. So a few things that we want to talk about is the approach to reading the overall reading section itself. Should we read? Should we skim? What should we do here? Well, because this is a reading test, I definitely highly recommend that we start off with reading. Now, like I said, sometimes we run out of time at the end of the test because of the amount of time. So we will have some options, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit as far as how to strategically get your answers get as many answers correct if you do have to skim. But overall, we want to start with the strategy of definitely reading the reading section. We want to start off with the reading instead of going to the questions first. This is another strategy that a lot of times is used in classrooms. I use it myself to get an idea of what the questions are, so when you're reading, you can be looking for it. The problem with that is two things. One, there's not enough time to do that. And two, while you're reading, you're actually going to be distracting yourself from the actual facts and details as a whole that you're going to need to be answering all of these questions. And you'll end up having to go back and forth several times as opposed to just reading it once. Now, as I mentioned a couple times, the reading test is one of the main types of questions are going to be facts about the facts and details of the passage. In fact, a little more than half of the test questions on the whole 40 questions that we have will be about facts and details. So for that reason, while we're reading, we do want to be aware of the facts and details, not necessarily your deepest feelings and thoughts or metaphors or what you think it could be possibly going to be questions about, but just focusing on pulling out facts and details as we read. Now, today we're going to be looking specifically at this paired passage, so I'm only going to be reading passage A and then pulling out the information as I go, and then we're going to go over to the question. So passage A, I'm going to first take a look just to help me out. Passage A is adapted from Plastic, A Toxic Love. So I'm just going to put toxic up here just so that I can remember that's what passage A is about. And then passage B is adapted from American Plastic, Cultural History. So American, and I think I'll just leave it at that. So then I'm ready to begin. So I'm going to read, looking for facts and details to come out as I'm reading so that it doesn't take away from the reading and take more time. So designers were enthralled by the universe of possibility from plastic's earliest days. They loved the design freedom that synthetics offered and the spirit of modernity the materials embodied. The furniture designer Paul T. Frank, material like bakelite, the world's first synthetic plastic, in the vernacular of the 20th century, the language of invention of synthesis, and he urged his fellow designers to use their full imaginative powers to explore the new materials' frank artificiality. As interpreted by Frankel and other designers working with bakelite in the 30s and 40s, that was the language of streamlining, a lingo of curves and dashes and teardrop shapes that created a feeling of speed and motion in everyday objects. Streamline a fountain pen, and even that stolid item declared, "We're hurtling toward the future here." There was another reason designers embraced plastics. From the mid-20th century on, modern design has been guided by an egalitarian gospel, a belief that good design needn't cost a lot of money, and even the most mundane items could be things of beauty. Get the most of the best to the most of the least, was the way Ray and Charles Eames put in their famous tongue-twisting credo. Plastics were the ideal medium for that mission. Malleable, relatively inexpensive, and made for mass furniture. So I'm going to put that it doesn't cost as much, that they can be malleable or flexible. Yes, as in any new relationship, there were risks. It was all too easy to exploit plastic's powers of mimicry. To produce the kinds of imitations, pseudo-wood cabinets, and faux leather recliners that contributed to the growing reputation of plastics as an inferior material. Plastics' adaptability and glibness undermined their capacity to achieve dignity as legitimate materials worthy of being taken seriously, one critic wrote. This impression was exasperated by people's unfortunate experiences with plastics in the immediate post-war years. There were plastic plates that melted, plastic toys that cracked on Christmas morning, plastic raincoats that grew clammy and fell apart in the rain. Polymer technology improved during the 1950s as manufacturers figured out how to make better plastics, and even more important, how to match the right polymer with the right application. But the damage to plastics' reputation had been done. And so when you're pulling out the facts and details, as you noticed, we're not going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what's going to be the most important, and we're not writing out paragraphs or rephrasing anything. We're just pulling out these facts and details because, as I said, more than 50%, about 57% of the test is going to be coming right from these facts and details types of questions. So just pulling them out will help us when we get to the questions have an idea of where to go to find the answers if we don't recall it right away. So now we're ready to go on to our questions. I'm going to go ahead and clear this. So that I can scroll up to the questions, and we're going to just focus on passage 11, the 11 through 14 passage A. In the context of passage A, the author uses the description of fountain pen, lines 15 to 16, most nearly to. So I'm actually going to go right to the passage. Always go back to the passage. This is an open book test, so we always want to go back to where it tells us, especially when we're given line numbers. And just as kind of a side note, this is definitely one of the things to keep in mind if you are running short on time when you get to that last passage, to go ahead and do the easy questions first where they're telling you exactly where to go, like line numbers or one word choice, vocabulary word types of questions. So this tells us to go to line 15 through 16, and we're looking for the description of the fountain pen and what is it being used by the author itself. So I'm going to come back here. I'm looking at line 15, and I find where it says streamline a fountain pen. So here's the phrase in context. And even that stolid item declared, we're hurtling toward the future here. So this is what we want to know. Like, what is the purpose of the author using this phrase fountain pen? And if we are not sure exactly what's coming to mind, for me, a fountain pen is, it is, a fancier type of pen that was used a long time ago, so it could be outdated. So let's look at then looking to see which ones we can eliminate so that we can have a clearer picture of which one is correct. And we've talked about that strategy in the English section of looking for what's wrong, to take that out of the mix before looking for what's right. So let's look at A. So A says it's a lament the way that unique objects began to look identical after the advent of streamlining. Well, this, to me, with a fountain pen, I wouldn't say that that's it at all. So it's not being sad about that everything's looking the same. In fact, we talked about that there's different looks and different purposes for it. B says critique designers. So we've got lament, critique, illustrate, and exemplify. Critique designers for creating items that were beautiful rather than functional. Well, this isn't really a critique because it's actually a positive thing. We're hurtling toward the future here, so I'm going to take this out because we're not critiquing that. C says illustrate how even everyday items could be designed to appear modern. So here we have the idea of a fountain pen, something that was everyday, that was old, but with plastics could be used more modern, appeared more modern into the future. So I'm thinking this is probably a good one. Let me read D just to make sure. D says exemplify the kind of item that remained largely unaffected by new design trends. Well, that one we can rule out too because we're talking about the fountain pen, which was not plastic, and would have not been modern either. So our option here would be C. So that is the answer to C. So we always want to go back to our passage to where we have the open book answers for making sure that we are getting the correct answer. So we're just going to do 12, 13, and 14 of this passage. So let's continue. So the main idea, number 12, the main idea of the second paragraph, lines 17 through 26, is that plastic. So again, before I take a look, I'm going to go right back. And so here's a key thing when it asks you for main idea, purpose, the primary purpose that something serves as. So we want to make sure we know. Sometimes this might say the main idea of the whole passage, of the purpose of the main passage, but this says the main idea of the second paragraph, and it gives us our line numbers to look at. And so we can go to our second paragraph. I'm just gonna come back up here, 17 to 26, and take a look at here. Now, when we are using this reading test and we're asked about the main idea of something, we can use our knowledge of good writing to help us with coming up with the main idea or the topic or the purpose of a passage by looking at the paragraph itself. Here's our paragraph, 17 to 27. And what we're looking for is to see what that main idea is. So think about what you know about your writing, and when you're writing an essay, where should a reader be able to go to be able to know what your essay is going to be about? There's two spots that we can go to be able to get this information. And if you had words written down here, you could use that, but you could also be looking at the first sentence and last sentence of this paragraph to see kind of what the main idea should be about this paragraph, with the intro and the conclusion telling us a little bit more about what this paragraph would be. So there was another reason designers embraced plastics. From the mid-20th century on, modern designers had been guided by an egalitarian gospel. And then I'm going to come down here to the last sentence. Plastics were the ideal medium for the mission, malleable, relatively inexpensive, and made for mass manufacture. So I had those notes written down there too, so I could also have that here. So as far as the main purpose, we could be thinking a few different things, but let's take a look at our answers. And again, we want to use the eliminate what is wrong, being careful that we're not falling into any kind of questions that are close to the right answer, but are also actually very wrong. So the main idea of the second paragraph, F says, appealed to the prevailing philosophy of providing great designs to many people for a low cost. Well, if we go back to that passage, we did have a lot of different designs, and we did talk about it being inexpensive. So that is definitely one that is in the running. Let's see if there's a better option. G says, quickly became popular enough to inspire a number of famous credos and advertising slogans. In that particular passage, that is not the overall, in that second paragraph, that's not the main idea, although we did hear those words, and that credo and advertising slogans was something that was read, but not the main idea here in this passage. H says, created a challenge for designers who were not used to working with such a malleable material. Well, in this particular paragraph, it just mentions that it is malleable. It doesn't talk about the design, the challenge for the designers, so I'm going to rule that out. That's not a main idea. And J, it inspired an artistic movement whose members prize mundane objects rather than beautiful ones. And again, although maybe the uses of, how it was all being used could be a stretch, but the overall, that's not the main idea. The main idea was that it really went with the flow of the philosophy of providing great designs for many people at that low cost. All right, let's go on to question 13. clear this off. Question 13 says, according to passage A, one reason for designers' early interest in plastics was that. So we could go back to our passage A, we could look at our notes to see, or we could see if we could recall from our own thoughts of what we thought was the reason for the designers' earlier interest in plastic. So looking at our answer choices, again, we want to look to see if we can eliminate our choices as we go, and ruling them out. So the first one is that that one reason for designers' early interest in plastic was that the material's ability to be freely shaped encouraged inventiveness. Well, definitely that was mentioned as far as at the very beginning, the first paragraph, where they were encouraging people to use their invention to stir, more designs. So that is definitely going to be in the running. One reason for designers' early interest in plastic: consumers' demand for attractive designed items was high. Well, at the very beginning, this wasn't something consumers, the people buying, would have really been looking for as far as the attractiveness. It was brand new. So that one I'm going to rule out pretty much right away. C, a person creating everyday items out of plastics was seen as a bold risk taker. Again, this one is not a reason for the designer's early interest. Plastic was something that was brand new, so we can rule that out. And older materials like bakelite was difficult to work with. So we're looking at the early interest, so we wouldn't be even considering the older materials, although that could be possibly true. The early interest was that it was able to be freely shaped, and then also encouraged the invention for many different designs. So our answer should be A. Last question that we're going to look at, question 14. It can reasonably be inferred from passage A that before the 1950s, plastics manufacturers had not yet figured out. So 1950s, we're talking about, when we go back to our passage in the last paragraph, we had mentioned, there was mention of the 1950s. Let me get back up here so we can see that. Where we have in that last paragraph of passage A, this impression was exasperated by people's unfortunate experience. I'm going to skip down to where 1950s is mentioned. Polymer technology improved during the 1950s as manufacturers figured out how to make plastics, and even more important, how to match the right polymer with the right application. So that was during the 1950s, but our question is about before the 1950s. So if our importance is that we're able to see that match, and also that they're now seeing what plastics are going to be best for it in the 1950s, that would imply that before the 1950s, that was not the case yet, because it says more importantly, they're now able to match the right type of plastic. So let's take a look at our answers, again, doing the same exact thing, looking to see what we can eliminate. We're looking to see that it can be most reasonably inferred that before the 1950s, plastic manufacturers had not yet figured out how to mold plastics to create the impression of streamlining. Well, this is something that they were able to do. So that one we can take out. They were able to use, they had already discovered before the 1950s, how malleable and how easy it was to make the plastics be designed into really any kind of shape. G says, which plastics were best suited for specific purposes? Well, this is basically what we just read, that by the 1950s, or that during the 1950s, we see that this is happening. So that would be implied before that. We didn't see that. Let's check the other options just to make sure. H says whether consumers would buy everyday items made of plastics. This was not the case either, so it was something that consumers did buy. pretty readily at the beginning. And lastly, whether designers would embrace working with plastics. And again, the designers were all about it at the beginning. We can see this at the first paragraph. So this was something from before the 1950s that was already figured out. So that leaves us with our best option of what the manufacturers before the 1950s had not figured out. We want to make sure we highlight that, is that plastics were best suited to specific purposes. So I hope that this was helpful today, and going through how to process and to answer these questions. Remember that if you are running out of time towards the end of the test for the English, that we can definitely look for clues within our passage to see which questions would be the easiest to answer. Some of these I've pointed out along the way, but definitely when we have one-word types of choices and or where it tells us to go back to our line numbers, we definitely want to go back there. But the main takeaway message for our strategy for our reading is to definitely go back to where the answers would be in this open book test section of the test. There's 4 passages that are open book because you've just read it. So the answers are there. And we do want to keep our pencil moving and make sure that we're choosing the best answer. Look out for words that could be distracting. They will tend to use word choices that you can remember reading in the passage, but be careful that it makes sense to answer the specific question that you're on. So always go back to that as well. Watch out for things that are going to take you off on a tangent and not actually answer the question at all. Don't fall for those types of tricks. And that's about it. Until next time, I hope that you did well. If you're while you're watching this, go ahead and drop in the comments how many of these you got correct. If you still have a question, please go ahead and ask your question, and I will gladly be able to get back to you. If you have an interest in honing your skills in this reading area, if this is one that you struggle with as far as time, as far as knowing how to answer the questions and keep your pencil moving and get the right question correct, I do offer intensive one-on-one reading. I do offer reading intensive hour-long classes. So we just focusing on the reading. If that's something you need, you can write down and below, drop it in the comments that you would like to have more information on that, and I would gladly send you the link to go ahead and get registered for that. As always, Ms. Tori and I are here to help you get your max score, to get that goal score or more, and it is our privilege to work with you, and I will talk to you the next time. Thanks again, and